When I was 12, my family moved into a new house. It was in a quiet neighborhood, far enough from the main road that nights felt almost too silent. The house was bigger than the one we used to live in, and my parents liked it because it had a large backyard. The house also had a big attic, the kind with wooden stairs you pulled down from the ceiling. My parents used it for storage right away. They put boxes of old clothes, Christmas decorations, and other junk up there. I didn't think much of it at first. A few weeks after moving in, my parents had to go out one evening. They left around 7, saying they wouldn't be back until close to midnight. My older brother was staying over at a friend's house, so I had the place to myself. I stayed in the living room watching TV. It felt good having the whole house quiet. I had snacks on the table, a blanket over me, and nothing to worry about. Or at least that's what I thought. Around 9 o'clock, I heard something. It wasn't loud, just faint, like a dragging sound. I muted the TV and listened. It was coming from above me, from the attic. At first, I tried to ignore it, but the sound didn't stop. It came in slow, steady movements, like something was being pulled across the attic floor. I stood up and looked at the ceiling where the attic door was. My parents had left the attic ladder folded up. I just stared at it. The sound came again, dragging. I told myself it had to be a raccoon or maybe a squirrel, but it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded solid, like a person shifting their weight. Finally, I grabbed the step stool from the kitchen and climbed up just enough to pull the attic string. The wooden stairs unfolded with a creak. I felt my heart beating as I stood there, staring up at the dark opening above. I climbed a few steps. Not all the way, just enough to peek at the attic door. It was cracked open, only an inch or two. That's when I saw it. A pale face. It was right there, pressed to the gap. Eyes wide, skin so white it almost glowed in the dark. I froze. My whole body locked up. The face didn't move. It just looked down at me through that tiny space. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually my body reacted. I bolted down the steps, ran straight to the front door and locked it. Then I grabbed the phone. Instead of calling the police first, I called our neighbor, Mrs. Thompson. She was in her 60s and lived across the street. I was shaking so hard I could barely explain what I saw. She told me to stay put and that she was coming right over. When she got there, she didn't waste any time. She called the police. The officers arrived about 10 minutes later. By then I was sitting on the couch, gripping the phone so tightly my hand hurt. I didn't even want to look up at the attic door. 2 officers went up with flashlights. I watched from the bottom of the stairs. I was ready to see them drag some stranger out of the attic, but they didn't. They searched every corner and found nothing. One officer came down shaking his head, saying the attic was empty. I felt embarrassed, like maybe I imagined the whole thing. But then the other officer called out from up there. He had found something. In the far corner of the attic, behind some boxes, there was a crumpled sleeping bag. Next to it were empty candy wrappers and a half-empty bottle of water. Someone had been living up there. The officers searched again, more carefully this time, but they still didn't find anyone. As they were packing up to leave, one of the officers noticed something strange. On the far wall of the attic, behind the boxes, there was a small opening. Just a hole, maybe 2 feet wide. When they shined a light into it, they realized it led directly into the air vents of the house. That meant whoever had been living in the attic wasn't just staying up there. They had been crawling through the vents, silently watching us from the dark, moving around while we were asleep. The thought made my skin crawl. After the police left, my parents came home. Mrs. Thompson stayed until they arrived, so I wouldn't be alone. I told my parents everything. They believed me, especially after seeing the sleeping bag and wrappers. The next day, my dad sealed the attic hole with plywood and nails. He even had a contractor come out later that week to check the vents and close off any space big enough for a person to fit through. We never found out who it was. For months, I couldn't fall asleep without thinking about it. I kept wondering how many nights that person had been crawling through the vents while we lived there. How many times they were inches away, listening as I talked or slept. Even now, years later, I get uneasy whenever I hear noises above me, because I'll never forget that pale face staring down through the crack. I was around 16 at the time of the story. My family had gone to visit relatives out of town, but I stayed behind. I had a lot of homework and didn't feel like traveling. They left early in the afternoon and planned to come back the next day. The house felt quiet after they left. I wasn't scared of being alone, just not used to how still everything got at night. Usually there was always someone walking around, the TV running, my brother playing music upstairs. That night, there was nothing but silence. I stayed in my room most of the evening, did some homework, played games on my laptop, and watched a few videos on my phone. I had a small desk lamp on, and my curtains were drawn shut. Sometime around 1 a.m., I woke up. I didn't even remember falling asleep, but I must have drifted off while scrolling on my phone. The room was dark except for the glow of the screen. Then I heard it, a faint sound. At first, I thought it was tree branches brushing against the siding of the house. But it wasn't windy. The air was still. The sound came again. Soft taps. It was coming from the window. My bedroom was on the second floor. There was no porch roof under it, no balcony, nothing but straight siding all the way down to the ground. You couldn't reach that window without a ladder. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. Not random like rain. Not soft like bugs. It sounded like fingers. I froze. I didn't get up. I didn't even turn my head to look at the window. I just lay there, trying to breathe quietly, my phone still glowing in my hand. The tapping stopped for a few seconds. Then it started again. I wanted to grab my phone and call someone, but my hands felt like they were glued to the blanket. I told myself not to move, not to make a sound. Minutes passed. It felt like hours. Finally, the tapping stopped completely. The silence after it was almost worse. I stayed like that, lying perfectly still, staring at the ceiling until the first hint of daylight crept into the room. When the sun finally rose enough to light up the window, I slowly turned my head. That's when I saw handprints. Faint, but clear enough to see, smudged across the outside of the glass. Long streaks of dirt where fingers had dragged down the pane. I got out of bed and walked closer, my heart pounding. The prints were definitely on the outside. Someone had been standing there in the middle of the night, staring in. But how there was no ladder, no porch roof, nothing for anyone to stand on. I checked the yard from my window. It was empty, just grass and the old fence. Later that morning, my family came home. I told them about the tapping and showed them the glass. My dad went outside to look but didn't find footprints, no ladder, no sign of anyone being there at all. He said maybe it was a prank, maybe kids threw mud or something. But I knew it wasn't. Those handprints weren't thrown. They were pressed. Even now, years later, I can still picture those faint smudges on the glass. Sometimes when I'm home alone at night, I still wonder who was standing there in the dark watching me, and how they got there. This happened when I was about 15. It was the middle of summer, and my parents had gone to a dinner party across town. They told me they'd be home late, maybe close to midnight. So I had the place to myself. I wasn't the kind of kid to throw parties or invite people over when my parents were gone. I liked being alone. I planned out the night the same way I always did. Video games, snacks, maybe a late movie, then crash on the couch. The air was warm that night. The windows were cracked open, and I could hear crickets outside. It was peaceful. I sat in the living room with the big screen glowing, controller in my hand, completely zoned in. That's when everything shut off. The TV blinked out. The lamps went dark. The whole house was swallowed in black. For a second I thought the power just cut across the block, but when I looked out the front window, I could still see porch lights on in the houses across the street. It was only my house. I set the controller down and sat still for a moment. At first, I thought maybe the power breaker went out. That had happened once before after a storm. But the night was calm, and nothing outside looked unusual. I reached for my phone to use it as a flashlight. That's when I noticed something strange. The Wi-Fi router on the shelf still had blinking green lights. The power was out, but the router was still on. That didn't make sense. I tried to shake it off. I opened the kitchen drawer, pulled out the flashlight, and clicked it on. The beam cut through the living room. I decided I'd head down to the basement and check the breaker box. But then I caught something from the corner of my eye. Through the back window, across the yard, near the tree line, I saw a figure. It was tall, standing perfectly still at the very edge of the grass, where the yard met the dark woods. I could only make it out because of the moonlight. I froze. For a moment, I thought maybe it was a shadow or a trick of the light. But no, it was a person. Someone was out there, standing motionless, facing the house. I turned off the flashlight, crouched low, and grabbed my phone again. My first instinct was to call my parents. I dialed, but all I heard was static. A faint hiss, like the line was dead. I tried again. Same thing. I backed away from the window and sat on the floor. The house was completely silent. A few minutes passed. Then the lights flicked back on. The TV glowed again. The lamps lit up. Everything was back to normal. My heart was still pounding, but I forced myself to peek out the window. The figure was gone. I stood there for a while, shaking, not sure what to do. When I finally worked up the courage, I went to the back door. Slowly, I opened it just enough to look down at the steps. That's when I saw them. Muddy shoe prints. Fresh, leading up the steps and stopping right at the door. I locked it as fast as I could, pulled the blinds shut, and sat in the living room with every light on until my parents came home. I never told them exactly what I saw, just that the power went out and I got spooked. I didn't think they'd believe me about the figure. Years later, I still think about that night whenever I look out at the yard in the dark, because I know someone is still out there,